Okay, let's jump right in. We're going to talk about a war that, for most Americans at the time, was fought far, far away. But the bill that came after it landed right on their doorstep, and that bill changed everything.
It really did. We're talking about the French and Indian War.
Mm.
And if you want to find the starting point for the American Revolution, you don't start in 1776. You have to go back here. This is all about the massive debt that came out of that victory.
Right. So today we're going to try and answer three big questions for you. First, why did Great Britain suddenly need so much money? Second, how did they try to get it from the colonies? And third, how did the colonists, react to
It's
this?
the perfect story of a victory that was so expensive it almost wasn't worth it.
So let's set the scene. The French and Indian War, which ran from 1754 to 1763, at its heart, this was a fight between Great Britain and France over land, specifically the Ohio River Valley.
Exactly. British colonists were pushing west. They wanted that land. But the French were already there. They'd built a whole series of forts to protect their fur trading routes, which were incredibly profitable.
So you have two of the world's biggest empires wanting the exact same piece of valuable real estate.
Yeah, a war was pretty much inevitable. And what started as this, regional conflict in North America just exploded. It became a global war. In Europe, they called it the 7 Years' War.
And in the end, Great Britain wins, and it's a huge victory. They get control of this vast territory, basically from the Atlantic coast all the way to the Mississippi River.
A monumental win. But the financial cost was, well, disastrous. To fight a war on multiple continents, the British government had to borrow and borrow and borrow.
And here's the number that really tells the story. By the end of the war, Britain's national debt had nearly doubled. It hit about 140 million pounds.
Which is just a mind-boggling number for the 1700s. To give you some perspective, that's like 50 times the government's entire annual income before the war. It wasn't just a big debt, it was a crisis. Just the interest payments were eating up a huge chunk of the national budget.
So King George III and his government are staring at this mountain of debt, and they know they have to do something fast. They need new money, new revenue, and they look across the ocean and think, well, the American colonies seem like the most logical place to get it.
Right, they just spent a fortune protecting the colonists and winning all this new land for them. It seemed only fair to ask them to chip in, and this is where the whole dynamic starts to shift. The fighting was over, but the expense was just beginning.
Exactly, because now they had to manage this enormous new territory. So British leaders decide they need to station a permanent army in North America. We're talking about 10,000 professional British soldiers.
And these troops had basically two main jobs. First was to protect colonists from Native American tribes who were, fighting to keep their land. And second, to make sure the French didn't try to sneak back in and reclaim anything.
But keeping an army of 10,000 fed and supplied in the American wilderness, that's an incredibly expensive and difficult thing to do. You have to ship food, uniforms, ammunition, hundreds of miles.
So Parliament's argument was pretty straightforward. We're paying for your defense, so you need to help pay the bill. And that need for money is what finally killed a long-standing British policy called salutary neglect.
That's a really important term. Let's break down what salutary neglect actually means.
For decades, Britain had, for the most part, just left the colonies to run themselves. They were too busy with wars in Europe. So the colonies passed their own laws, they had their own assemblies, and crucially, they raised their own local taxes.
So this neglect was actually salutary or beneficial. It let the colonial economies boom, and it gave the colonists this really strong sense of independence. They were used to being in charge of their own affairs.
But after the war, the new prime minister, George Grenville, he looked at the situation and said, this has to stop.
Yeah.
He argued that it was time Americans paid their fair share to the empire. This hands-off approach was over.
And you can imagine, for the colonists who had known nothing but self-rule for generations, this sudden tightening of control was a real shock.
It felt like the rules of the game had been changed overnight.
Which brings us to the first real attempt to get that money, the Sugar Act of 1764. This law put a tax on things like foreign molasses and sugar coming into the colonies. It also taxed some luxury goods like wine and silk.
And the tax itself was one thing, but it was the enforcement that really scared people. The act gave British customs officials sweeping new powers to search colonial ships and warehouses for smuggled goods.
And this is a key point. If you were accused of smuggling, you didn't get a normal trial with a jury of your peers. Instead, they sent you to a special military-style court, a vice admiralty court, run by a single British-appointed judge.
Which colonial merchants saw as a complete violation of their rights as Englishmen. The right to a trial by jury was fundamental, so now their profits are being hit and their legal rights are being ignored.
But the act that really poured fuel on the fire, the one that united almost everyone in opposition, came the very next year. The Stamp Act of 1765.
This was a huge deal because it was the first direct tax levied by Parliament on the colonists.
Let's clarify that difference. Why was a tax on paper so much more explosive than a tax on sugar?
It was about the principle of the thing. A sugar tax was an external tax on goods coming into the country. The colonies had sort of accepted those. But the Stamp Act was an internal tax. It was a tax on business conducted entirely inside the colonies.
So what did it do exactly?
It required you to buy a special government stamp for almost any piece of paper you used. We're talking legal documents, newspapers, land deeds, even playing cards and dice.
Wow. So you couldn't really do anything without paying this tax directly to Britain.
Exactly. And the money raised was specifically set aside to pay for those British troops stationed in America. The colonists were being taxed to pay for the army that was now policing them.
The reaction was not good.
It was immediate outrage. Across all 13 colonies, the argument was simple. Only our own elected assemblies, the people we vote for, have the right to impose a direct internal tax. Parliament is 3,000 miles away. They have no right to reach into our pockets like this.
And this is where that famous slogan comes from, right? No taxation without representation.
That's it. It summed up the whole argument perfectly. Since they had no representatives sitting in the British Parliament, Parliament had no authority to tax them.
But the British had an answer for that, didn't they? This idea of virtual representation.
They did. It sounds a little strange to us today, but their argument was that Parliament didn't just represent the people who voted for them. They claimed that Parliament represented the interests of everyone in the British Empire, whether you were a farmer in Virginia or a merchant in London.
So someone who has never set foot in North America is supposed to be looking out for your best interests.
That was the official line. And the Americans just completely rejected it. They called it a legal fiction. They were afraid that if they gave in on the Stamp Act, it would set a precedent. What would stop Parliament from passing a dozen more taxes?
So resistance starts to get organized, and it wasn't just, polite letters of complaint.
Not at all. Groups like the Sons of Liberty started to form. They used intimidation tactics. They burned effigies of British officials. Basically, they made life very difficult for anyone who tried to enforce the tax.
But the most powerful weapon they had was economic.
Without a doubt. Merchants in Boston, New York, Philadelphia, all the major ports, they organized these non-importation agreements.
Which is just a fancy term for a boycott, right?
Exactly. A huge coordinated boycott. They just stopped buying British goods. The plan was to hurt the British economy so badly that merchants in England would scream at Parliament to get rid of the tax.
And women were a huge part of this. They started making their own cloth. They called it homespun. Instead of buying imported British fabric, it was a domestic chore turned into a powerful political statement.
And it worked. It worked perfectly. British factories saw their orders dry up. People in England started losing their jobs. Those merchants who depended on colonial trade flooded Parliament with petitions.
So, facing this economic crisis at home, Parliament backs down. In 1766, they repeal the Stamp Act, and there were huge celebrations in the colonies. They thought they had won.
They did win the battle, but they completely missed the bigger warning. Because on the very same day they repealed the Stamp Act, Parliament passed something called the Declaratory Act.
And this one had no tax attached to it. It was just a statement.
It was a statement of power.
Yeah.
It said that Great Britain had the full authority to make laws for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. Parliament was essentially saying, okay, we'll take this one tax away, but don't get any ideas. We're still in charge, and we can do whatever we want.
So the fundamental disagreement, who has the ultimate power, wasn't solved at all.
Not even close. And it only took about a year for them to try again. In 1767, we get the Townshend Acts.
What were these?
These were a new set of taxes or duties on imported goods: glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea. Since they were external taxes on imports, the British thought maybe the colonists would accept them.
But the really clever and, from the colonists' point of view, sinister part was what they planned to do with the money. The revenue from the Townshend Acts was going to be used to pay the salaries of the colonial governors and judges.
And that is absolutely critical. Up to this point, those salaries were paid by the local colonial assemblies. This gave the assemblies huge leverage. It's called the power of the purse. If a royal governor did something the assembly didn't like, they could just threaten to stop paying him.
It was their main check on royal authority.
Hmm.
So by paying the governors directly from Britain, the Townshend Acts would make those officials loyal to the king, not to the people they were governing.
It was a direct attack on their power of self-government. Predictably, the colonists responded with even more boycotts. The cycle just started all over again.
And it's important to remember, these weren't just abstract political debates. These taxes made life harder for regular people. Prices for basic items went up. It became harder for small farmers and shopkeepers to make ends meet.
But that shared economic hardship actually had an interesting side effect. It pushed the colonies to become more self-sufficient. People took pride in buying American-made goods to avoid the British taxes.
And all of this shared struggle, this shared anger, it started to build a common identity. For the first time, people started to think of themselves not just as Virginians or New Yorkers, but as Americans, all facing the same threat.
So what starts as an argument over how to pay off a war debt becomes something much, much bigger. It becomes a fundamental conflict over power, over liberty, and over who gets to govern whom.
The British felt they were justified. They'd spent a fortune defending the colonies. The colonists felt their fundamental rights as Englishmen were being trampled on, and with every new tax and every new protest, the two sides just drifted further and further apart.
The trust was just completely gone. And the argument over who had the final say on taxes, Parliament or the colonies themselves, was a question that just couldn't be compromised on.
So the incredible cost of winning one war ended up creating the perfect recipe for the next one, a revolution that would create a whole new nation. It all started with money, but it ended with a fight over ideas. And that disagreement is what it all really came down to.
Good luck with your studies.
See you next time.